Okay, I'm finally gonna make a video and try to finish this stupid thing I started. And uh, what I have on this website I made is I have a basic kind of class thing on making a project finance model. Now this is I have to finish it up. I have to explain it better, and these videos have this music in the background that everybody moans about. They're, the models are kind of basic. I think you can get the same thing from these companies. But what's much more interesting to me is the second one. Now, on the second one, I'm trying to make a A to Z class, and I kind of stopped about 1 year ago, I think, because I hit a wall. Where's my wall that I hit? Here. And that wall is the wall you hit when you have some financing and circular references. Now, I've done this for a long time, obviously, but how do you structure a model and what should you really do when you hit the wall? Now, my suggestion right now, and I'm going to go through this, is to set up some general inputs for debt, not the issue by issue debt. Now, I should uh, uh, explain something else. Okay, when you hit the wall, if you have multiple debt issues, which I think, I don't know if most project finance has multiple debt issues, but one whole heck of a lot does. Then what happens? How do you set this up if you have this possibility of having the debt to capital constraint be in play or the DSCR constraint be in play, and that DSCR can, I said be in play, that's kind of a silly thing, that can be instrumental in driving the amount, the size of the debt if you've got a downside case or a base case. And then there are some other constraints. Now, after you've put this in, I suggest then you go issue by issue and decide if you're going to use sculpting or not. And the sculpting is going to be tough with multiple debt issues if they are all sculpted. And I've already addressed in another video, but there are some additional kind of complications once you start doing this in a real world case. So then you can choose, if you're not doing sculpting, to input a repayment percentage. And so that's how you might set up some of the structure. Now, I think I got to slow down and reverse a little bit, because here's what this video is really about. This video is about structuring, oops, I guess that doesn't matter, is structuring the financing part of a model. And when you're going to structure this, I suggest going through my kind of 5 parts, which is start with the size of the model, size of the debt, you idiot, and then and figure out if it's going to be sized by different techniques. That's extremely tricky. And well, I'll come back to this P50, P90 in a minute. And to get this right, then you move to the funding. And then you move to the debt repayments and the schedule of opening and closing balance and repayment and draws on the debt. Now, the most difficult thing almost always is coming up with this repayment. And if you're going to have sculpting, coming up with this repayment from multiple different sculpted debt issues can be really tricky. All right. Now I don't know how far I'm going to get with all of this, but I'm going to, and then finally, let's get a DSRA account in, and then we can put a profit and loss and a cash flow waterfall account. Now, I'm going to show you how to structure this model a little bit. This is part of the A to Z modeling. And I've got to come up with some exercises for you to do as if any one person in the whole world would ever do that. I mean, you have so much dramatically better things to do with your life than this. But now I've moved to the to the model, to the Excel model. And I'm going to post this Excel model, and I'm not going to give you a tiny little thing. I am actually going to limit what I put on the internet in one particular case, and that's with this template I have for solving every single circular reference in the whole model. Now, I have started this, and I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. I actually made a different video with Hedia on this. You know, here's the operations. We have some dates as normal. This time I have two different wind farms, and I really wanted to emphasize that if you change the standard deviation, you can see, and then I put a little reset button here. I wanted to emphasize and show you that this difference between P90 and P50 can be an enormous deal. And these are taken from a real wind study. I had to disguise some things. And the EPC cost is even from a real term sheet associated with this. And then I put some O&M expenses and some PPA assumptions. I didn't know what the actual PPA price, and I put a little spinner box in. Okay, and then we put in our different debt parameters. Now, if you're going to have multiple debt issues, some of these parameters are global, let me say, or I call general. Maybe global would be the better way to say these. This 80, this DSCR, and this DSCR, it could change over time. I am not, for now, I'm saying it's constant, and it can be different in this P50 and P90 case. So upstairs, I kind of showed you a little bit of the production. That was the standard deviation business. If we have a higher standard deviation, there's a much bigger difference between the P90 and the P50. Now, if you're looking at this, you can see that the project IRR is changing. Now, the second thing, which is a general input, is how are we going to fund the equity? We could put 0 here. And if we put 0, then all of the equity is pro rata. If we put 100%, it's all up front. And I didn't come up with this. I think Hetty did this kind of technique, which you don't have to put pro rata in and all this stuff. You can mix it all up. And then this debt service reserve account will most likely be associated with senior debt. And in this case, actually, I kind of have a little problem here. No, I don't have a problem, but yeah, well, maybe I do. I have a lot of problems in my life, but I made it really simple. So I started with this simple model and just put it during the construction period as a month by month kind of model, and then in the operation period, it's an annual model. So let's put 0.5 here and make this a percentage. Now, I am assuming, and I think rightly so, that this DSRA is going to be applicable to all of the debt issues. We're going to aggregate all of the debt and then take 50% of the next year's, if it's annual, next period, next year's debt service, and that's going to be in the DSRA. Now, this all creates horrible, nightmarish circular references. If you have a higher DSRA account, then and the debt will be larger, and then if you're using 80/20, if the debt is larger, the project cost is larger, the debt is larger. If the debt is larger, the DSRA is larger, then the project cost is larger, blah, 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 blah. Circular, circular, circular. If you're using a DSCR, to size the debt. Then the taxes affect the sculpting and the repayment. And if you have a higher PPA price, then you'll have more debt. If you have more debt, you'll have a higher DSRA. If you have a higher DSRA, well, it doesn't directly affect the taxes, but it could affect the interest income, and you could have all sorts of circular references. These are the nightmares. This is the hitting of the wall. Then I put a debt tenor in, and I said, well, maybe we should do all our sculpting in the model. That's what I really want to show you. Okay, and how about this? I think I'm going to have you do a little bit of analysis. Now, we've got issue 1, and I call this the capturing debt issue. I made up this name. Maybe there's a really better name for this. This has the longest tenor, and it's 55% of the total debt. So what I suggest is that if we have this with a 14-year debt tenor and a smaller percentage of the debt, let's figure out what we need to do to sculpt this debt issue. And then once we sculpt this debt issue, then we'll let the last one pick up everything else it needs to do to make this work. Now, when we sculpt this debt issue, what we're going to do is make sure that the repayment pattern exactly corresponds and it mirrors and it sculpts, whatever you want to call it. It's tailored against the cash flow itself. So here are some of the inputs. You could make it sculpted or not. You want to make an option to make it sculpted or not, and put some fees in and everything else. Okay, and then we have a fourth debt issue. Okay, enough, blah, blah, blah. Maybe I'm going too long. And then very quickly, I put some production in, some construction. I made a really simplistic S-curve. I put some revenues in and some O&M expenses, and then we get our our EBITDA. And this should really not say P50. This is just EBITDA. It could be P50 or whatever. And we get some net cash flow, and then we get our project IRR. And that's where I said, okay, we could do this in a P99 or a P50 case. All right, and then we can work through some depreciation and get our operating taxes and get an after-tax IRR. And that's the structure of the model. And here's the wall. Okay, now the first step of this is to just get all the cost right, and do not, here's my suggestion, do not, do not try to fill in the IDC, which is going to cause a circular reference, the upfront fees, or the DSRA. Or sometimes the development fees will also, if they're a model on a percentage basis, then if you have a higher cost, then the debt goes up, the IDC goes up. So these all things can cause circular reference. For now, just leave them out. I'm going to have another video that works through. So the first step for me, and I saw this years ago, and other people don't do this, and that's okay. What you could also do is down here, we're going to do this whole sources and uses on a period by period. You could kind of put the summary sources and uses here. I like to do it like this. I copied it from somebody else, so I'm not the only one who does this, because it really highlights where the circular references come from. So this first step is to do the debt size to figure out how much debt you have. This structuring business is a really big deal, I think. Put where to put stuff, in other words. Now, upfront equity is, we put this in. Remember, this was the percentage of upfront equity. This is for all the pro rata business. And so whatever is not upfront is pro rata. So it's just the total amount of funding we need minus the equity funding, and then we can figure out what percentage of the well, it's really the percentage of the equity that's going to be, or the equity. This is not really good. I think this should be the amount of the equity divided by the total equity. Well, we've already got the 50%. That was kind of stupid what I just said. So now we've got the debt size. That's my basic proposition. Now again, set up the same sort of, after you get the debt size, issue number 2 is to get the debt funding. Now try this without circular references, and it's going to be hard enough. It really is going to be hard enough to do this. And in fact, what I'm going to do, I think, let me see how we're doing. Oh, we're 16 minutes. It's not the end of the world, but I'm going to kind of stop when we get to the debt repayment and make a second video, because it's a little more complicated and perhaps a little more interesting. Okay, now once you have this 50% of the debt, notice again, I think putting stuff in the left column is so obvious, so goddamn obvious, and people don't do it. This is just directly from our input, duh. Now this one, you needed the sources and uses of funds to get there. And then you can just put how much total equity is up front, and then you take away how much you've already drawn. And I think what happened here is, and then you have how much is left. Now so that's pretty easy. The hard part is that the amount you've already drawn is the opening balance. Well, that's not really that hard, is it? That's what the opening balance does. It accumulates how much you've done, how much you've made, how much you've lost. Unfortunately, my account is pretty damn low. Okay, and then that's why I got to do some innovative modeling and show you different ways to do things, and go to big companies and ask to get paid for this crap. Okay, a little bit, not a lot. I'll explain this later. Now, using a minimum function is essential here. We're going to, we're going to take the minimum of how much total we need up here. That's what we started with. And we compare that to how much we have left to put in as equity. Okay, we have to start with equity, as equity is up front. And then the closing balance is that, and the opening balance is this. And then we see how much we'll borrow. Now, just 1 minute. This equity is only this. I'm gonna put the equity up front to be 100%, just for a minute. Now, remember that was in the general section. I hope when I go through these classes, sometimes I'm going to press Shift and F9 because I put everything on the page. I apparently have some psychological problems because I do that, according to some kind of survey thing. Now what happens is this was our remaining amount we have to borrow. We're gonna borrow everything in the first period, and then we still haven't borrowed our whole commitment. So this minimum is the smaller, again, of the funding needs, or the total. Now, if I want, let's put some more equity in here. So let's change our DSCR and make our DSCR 1.5. Okay, and I'm pressing Shift F9. I hope that our debt amount, our equity amount, went up here, okay, because of our lower DSCR. Okay, and that means now it takes 3 periods to kind of get all the equity in, which maybe is not very much, but whatever. Okay, that shows you how it works. Now, if I would have a 0 here, then we'd have 0 equity up front. Again, this all comes from the sources and uses of funds statement. Now, after you've done this, perhaps this should almost have another Shift Control E, another kind of subtotal, because we'll take this subtotal minus the equity that we actually fund up here, and I hope that's what that is. That's the remaining funding needs. And then we see, well, how much is debt of the funding needs and how much is equity? And pro rata is pro rata. We just split it up. Now we had 100% equity this time. What if I would have only put in 20% equity? So let's try this. So you go all the way up to this general financing assumptions, and you put in, instead of 100%, let's only put 20%. Okay, and then we'll kind of skip down again, and then where am I? Okay, here we are. We have a different pro rata funding need, and what's ever left over of the pro rata funding, I guess we funded all the equity up front. Then we even have some debt, some non-equity, non-upfront to fund after that. 87% comes from debt, 12% comes from equity. And again, you see how you need this up front. And you need this little summary thing to get the whole thing started. And then we just divide it up, and then finally we put our sources of funds in here. So that's setting it up. And I'm repeating myself again and again. Now, if you're really basic, maybe you don't want to do all of this. But as soon as you get a little bit more sophisticated, setting up the model and setting up this initial sources and uses is key. And now the rest of the thing is setting up the repayments and the interest. Now the interest, in a way, is the easiest part, because you just need a debt balance. And when we have a debt balance, now you see, oh, look at how smoothly this whole process flows. We have an opening balance, and of course we get our debt draws just from right here, the ones we just computed. But now I have different debt issues. And I said, okay, well, let's take the total amount of debt, what's in line 244. I hope you don't use these shit range names. Okay, which is in H 244. Okay, and we're going to take 55% of it. So that's how I set up these issue by issue kind of things, is what percent is in issue number 1, what percent is in issue number 2, and so on and so forth. Okay, is that hard? Maybe, I don't know. But again, you need this sources and uses to get there. So here's the amount of the debt, and it's 55%. So we take the 55% actually this time times the total debt funding, and then we get our funding. Now we need to put our repayment of debt in, and if it's sculpted, and if this is the capturing issue, we have to make sure that this repayment and the second repayment, okay, and these follow the same pattern, and the third repayment, perhaps we better graph all of these out, the third repayment, and they're all the same. And that's really the subject of not this video, but the subsequent video. Okay, and then we put all of our debt, interest rates in on an annual basis, and finally take leave the months per period or periods per month or whatever you want. It really should say months in the period, shouldn't it? Maybe I should revise this, because I'm going to upload this file for you. Okay, that you just take that and divide it by 12, multiply by 1, or when we switch it over here to annual basis, you do the same calculation, divided by 12, multiply by 12, and that's the same as multiplying it by 1, and you get the same result. And then, as always, the interest payment is the opening balance of the debt multiplied by the interest rate. The interest expense depends on if you're in the operation period or the construction period. And we just separate it on an accounting basis. The interest expense versus interest during construction is only accounting. This interest payment could be capitalized, which is different than interest capitalized for accounting purposes. Very confusing if you're just getting into this, but not a really big deal, actually, at the end of the day. So I just had this interest paid. If it was capitalized, then what you would do is you would borrow less money, but you would have more debt at the end of the period, so you'd have less debt to issue, and it's all whatever. You can look at other videos for that. Okay, and then we have to compute our fees. To compute the commitment fee, again, we need the total amount of debt from that was computed above, and that's just, and then we compute how much debt is left over, and that's the total commitment minus the opening balance. So that's not really very difficult. And then the commitment fees better be on a periodic basis, and I just was lazy, divided by 12, and then we have an upfront fee. Okay, and eventually this interest during construction, this commitment fee, and this upfront fee will go straight into the uses of funds, and I did not put those yet there because that causes a circular reference. And I want to show you a few methods. The classic method to resolve this, and then the UDF parallel model method, which is about a zillion times better than the copy and paste method. And if you think I'm arrogant for saying that, watch another video on it. Because I'm not. Well, I am a little. But what the heck? Okay? I struggled my whole life with this crap, and I deserve to, whatever. Okay, and then the exact same thing for debt issue 2. This is the percentage of debt, and then we take and multiply that number up there for the debt draws, and we put our interest rates for the second debt issue, and the third debt issue, and all the rest. And the hard part is the repayment of debt. And you can try to manually do your sculpting and go on forever and ever, or you can watch the next video and really see how it's going to work. And I'm even going to give you a couple of little exercises to play with. And finally, you better add up all the repayment, all the interest expense, interest during construction, and you probably should add up the debt balance too, the closing debt balance, because you're going to have to put that in the balance sheet. And later on I did that, but you can do this. Now, the rest of this works through this, no, I'm sorry. No, we've got the DSRA. The DSRA account is so, I used to go crazy with it. I really did. But once you lay it out, it's not nearly as bad. You need to, number one, just slap in the total debt service right from here. So again, it follows in a nice logical way. And then the debt service required is the next year's debt service multiplied by some number. Now, this is a stupid mistake. I, for some reason, divided by 12, but this is half the debt service for next year. So we start with this, and we just multiply that next year debt service by the 0.5. Now, you can use the offset function if you have period by period, or there are different ways to get this. Basically, it's the offset function with the sum of this. And then you say, okay, well, how much do we have in our DSRA account? It's kind of like that thing with the equity up front. So you take the amount up front, and then this is where I used to go, that's how much we need to fund. And later on, because we have some sculpting, the debt service keeps going up, so we have to increase our DSRA account to get that stuff for the next period. Now this is the trick. I don't know why it took me so stupidly long to get this, but it's such an easy one. You separate out the DSRA between how much is funded during construction and what happens to the DSRA after construction, because I don't know how many times I've said this over and over and over and over and over again, but this statement up here is a cash flow statement. It's just the cash flow statement during construction. You used to have something called sources and applications of funds in the early 80s and 70s before they came up with a cash flow statement. Whatever, that was cash flow. So what? And then so you just take this total funding you have up here and multiply it by a little true and false switch. And you go to the next one is the multiplied by the operation switch. And then when we're finished with your balance, now of course you could have withdrawals from the DSRA when you have deficient cash flow. But for structuring analysis, you're not normally going to put that in. Perhaps with the P90 case it could happen, but for now I'm not going to put that in. And the debt is repaid because the debt service goes down to zero. So we at the end, so we need a balance of zero, and that means we take away the beginning balance, and that means we got to have a negative number in this account, and that's another really important issue. Well, okay, and what you think is important, but that could be, why don't you use that DSRA as the final repayment of debt instead of giving it to equity, which you can do, but wouldn't you rather have a lower debt repayment right at the end? So if you're sculpting, basically you could have the same amount of debt, and that lower debt repayment at the end would mean you could have more debt in the rest of the period, and so forth. Okay, now I'm getting to the sculpting part of this, and this is a little tricky, and I'm going to go through it a little more slowly, and I'm going to I'll stop this video. So this is kind of structuring the debt. Okay.